Okay, thanks for waiting, everyone, and thanks for those of you who were able to trickle in. We're going to go ahead and get started. One quick favor, would you just please put in a number 1 in your little question box so that we can confirm we're all set up, that you can hear us? Awesome. Okay. Sorry about that. Amy, are you with us?
I am here.
Awesome. Okay, thank you guys so much for joining. As I said earlier, this is Kendall Robertson, Director of Marketing. This is the 2014 International Student Perspectives. We're really excited to have you. We're thinking this is going to be about 45 minutes, and I know it's a really hot topic, so I want to make sure that we can have time for questions. So I'd be remiss if I didn't take just a couple of minutes to give you an introduction to Uversity. I'm sure many of you are friends and partners and you already know us, but for those of you who don't, our mission here is really twofold. So number 1, we're helping institutions combat the trends in declining enrollment and with that, the increased competition that's occurring right now in the higher ed space. And we're doing that through our predictive social technology. And then on the student side, what we're really trying to do is create an innovative and personalized experience for students where they can use their mobile devices to connect with the institutions that they want to attend to and also connect with other admitted students as they go through the admissions process. So we're excited to tell you more about the survey, but first I want to introduce you to the rest of the panel. So here I am in the middle. Nothing interesting to say about me necessarily, but I am lucky to be joined by 2 of my esteemed colleagues. So on the left is Dr. Alex Sigillo. She's part of the Uversity team. You may have heard her on our previous webinars. And then we're extremely excited to introduce Dr. Amy Morgenstern. Amy, you want to say a hi and hello?
Hello to all. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we're really lucky. Amy, it's actually kind of a funny story. Amy came into our offices a couple of weeks ago as part of a research project we were doing. She's the owner and lead consultant for Blue Stars Admissions Counseling. And throughout our conversation, she kept referencing her students and the students she counsels throughout the admissions process. And we realized there was a lot of synergy and overlap between her knowledge of the international and first generation student space and what Uversity was doing. So Amy, we're psyched to have you. Okay, so really quickly, just getting into the agenda. This is pretty straightforward. You've seen these before. We're going to start out by really just giving some background, digging into what's happening with enrollment, why the US, why are students coming, and why are schools looking outside of traditional domestic enrollment towards the international space. And we're going to use some of the data that's just been released. Really fortunate timing. Many of you probably know that the Institute of International Education just released their 2014 Open Doors report. So we're definitely going to make sure we dig into some of that, as well as some of the traditional surveys that have been in the market for some time, like Noel Levitt's. And then the second piece we're really excited to share are the results from our most recent survey. So this is the first time that we've really taken our own student population here at Uversity to take a look at what's happening with the international student space. So we're going to dig into the data there and talk about as well the usage of technology, communication preferences, and just some general sort of experiences with the admissions process. And certainly last but not least, we're going to bombard you with data and then try to distill that data into recommendations that should help with your international strategy. And that's someplace that we're really excited to have Amy. She's got a lot of experience and a lot of firsthand perspective, particularly from how these students and families deal with recruitment and what they're looking for. All right, so setting the stage. Some of this will probably be familiar to you all, but for the sake of keeping all the information in one place, we always like to go back to, sort of the core and the background of the topic at hand. So as I mentioned, this is timed really pretty fortuitously. This is the 15th annual International Education Week. So we're coming on the heels of, a lot of data being released. I mentioned the International Institute of Education. The Open Doors is one of the most relied upon resources for international student information. And we're going to look at sort of high level, why are students coming to the United States? Academic quality, campus culture. I think what's interesting to point out here is when you think about the sort of opinion of our domestic student population, I feel like these two are pretty evenly weighted. You know, we know that schools definitely compete on the academic level, but we're also familiar with the fact that students are making decisions a lot of the times based on, you know, the clubs and the organizations, the campus culture, the types of facilities that a campus has. But clearly with the international population, and certainly it's specific to each group, but in general, it's fair to say that the culture is really pretty much secondary. These are students that are very, very motivated, very driven, as are their families, and academic quality is really at the top of the list. And then what do they bring? No surprises here. I think it's really important to acknowledge that as a country, we're really focused on, you know, the global experience and creating future leaders. And so there's this argument for the diversity and the new perspectives in our classrooms. I know schools are benefiting from it, and certainly students are very much benefiting from it. And then, of course, we can't discount the impact on financial health of institutions. International students clearly seem like they make up a relatively small percentage of the total student enrollment, but their financial contributions are pretty staggering. And these numbers do continue to increase. So they're very, very top of mind for schools. This slide, I sort of laughed when we put this slide in because for those of you who have been to our last few webinars, I feel like this topic is unfortunately coming up quite regularly. We're seeing that, you know, after 20 plus years of constant increase and nonstop growth in the education sector, we've hit a period of plateau and even seen a slight decline. And so as all of you know even better than we do, what's happening is that institutions are being forced to compete for the same pool of students, and they're being forced, therefore, to go outside of their sort of home base and outside of their typical recruitment regions, whether that's out of state or overseas. It's clearly a very competitive atmosphere. Now for some good news. Again, a slide that is probably not surprising to any of you. We've been hearing a lot about these numbers, a 57% increase over the last 8 years. But even more significantly, I think, you know, the total enrolled right now, the total enrollment for international students is 886,000, just a little bit north of that. So clearly a population that's interested in coming, that we want to be here. And it's just really a question of how can we do the best job possible to make sure these students are finding a school that's the right fit for them, for their academic needs, as well as their cultural and social needs. And then looking at trends here again, our survey is going to focus predominantly on the undergraduate side of things, but we thought it was important to point out clearly there's both growth in the undergraduate and the graduate arena, but undergraduate is definitely over sort of eclipsing the graduate numbers. And according to the IIE, sorry, and the Institute of International Education, the growth in the undergraduate sector is really coming from two places. So the first is that Chinese undergraduate enrollment continues to increase. This year it was by 17% year over year. And secondarily, we're seeing an increase in the national government's sort of implementing and subsidizing education in the US. So, for example, Brazil, we've seen a 22% increase in students, and interestingly, a 43% increase in students from Kuwait. So really striking numbers, and I think something to take into account as we start to look at breakdowns by country, by region, and how we can most effectively work with these students. Looking at the countries of origin, so top places clearly are shown here on the map. China, India, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and actually Canada is number 5 on this list. And then additionally, I thought it was interesting to point out that the top attended universities by international students as of this year are New York University, USC, so Southern California, University of Illinois, Urbana, Columbia University, and Purdue University. So this is definitely something, Amy, I would love for you to jump in and talk about. But one of the things that's clear about that trend is we're seeing the urban schools, the research-oriented schools being, the top hosters of these students.
Kendall, can you get that list again? NYU, USC, UIUC?
UIUC, Columbia, and Purdue.
Got it.
And then Amy, I think you were going to tell yesterday, you had mentioned you had this really interesting story about a couple of the students you've recently been talking to, one of whom I think is from Saudi Arabia.
Well, yeah, so it was, interesting as I was looking through your slides in preparation for, my contributions, I've worked with students from each one of these countries. Most of the students I work with are from China. After that, I would say India, then South Korea, and then this summer I had the pleasure of working with 2 girls from Saudi Arabia. One of them just did SAT lessons with one of my tutors, and they were friends. And the other decided to apply to Columbia for human rights. And so there's some very interesting, she in the end didn't complete her application, and there were some very, very interesting sort of cultural moments we had together. And this is because of her own journey, her own way of thinking about, what happened was the college admissions process was very eye-opening for her. And I think she began the process with like an inkling of what she wanted to do, but no real understanding of what human rights studies are, for example. And so it just unleashed this sort of opening for her to think about her life. And I think she's going to come back. But of note is that she found me by herself.
Huh.
She read my blog posts, perhaps on the SAT, something like that. We met over Skype, and she actually funded her college admissions work, her essay work, with her own money. So there was something extremely independent about her, but then it was her community and her culture that really kept her from, in the end, applying this year. So I think it's the Saudi Arabia situation I'm finding to be extremely tricky. I've only worked with these 2 young women, so I can't speak for what the situation is like with men. But yeah, so that's just one very interesting thing. I work with many students in China. I haven't worked with students directly in South Korea. I've worked with students here in the States whose parents, like one parent might still be working in South Korea, that sort of situation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Amy, thank you. I didn't do a good job of introducing. Would you tell, just for the audience who doesn't necessarily know you as well, just a little bit more about what you do and how your consultations work, how students find you or the parents find you? I think that'd be really interesting for our audience.
Okay, well, so the name of my business is Blue Stars Admissions Consulting, and I run a small business. I started this on my own. I used to be a university professor myself. And I run a sort of, I guess I would say, higher-end, boutique, customized service where either through my blog or through word of mouth that families find me. And I work on everything from selecting majors to selecting schools. I sort of, take on the student in a full-on capacity, and the family as well, coaching them through a variety of schools. I, have many tools for them to think through the schools they want to go to. And then I very sort of as creatively and rigorously as possible help them think through their majors and then all of their essay work. So I also have editors on board, and so we work as a team, but we really get to know these students very well. I have an extensive sort of free write questionnaire for their essay work, so we know them on a very, very personal level. I've been doing this since, I've been in business since 2010 on my own. Before that, I worked in the Bay Area. right in Cupertino, right where sort of Apple is located, is just it's a huge sort of central location for college prep
Oh, interesting.
businesses, often Asian, run by Chinese proprietors, and that's where I got my start working for one of these companies. So, I really gained a lot of insight from that culture. Most of my, I would say 80% of my clients are first generation Chinese American students or Chinese students in China. Then I have some Indian students, some from South Korea, and then just these two females from Saudi Arabia, who I think will be spreading the word because we're really, really good friends. And there are lots of interesting cultural things I could get into there as well. So
Yeah.
I'm steeped relationally with this population every day.
Yeah. I mean, it's tremendous perspective. I think one of the things university is really keen on is understanding how we can, go back to students being students and not just numbers and benchmarks. And I know you had some thoughts to add on the cultural landscape slide that we have in front of us. You had covered a couple of these in terms of your experience with the young women from Saudi Arabia, but I know you've also had some interesting experiences. You mentioned the STEM focused education, and that's because students are so trained, it's ingrained in them to be career driven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I should have, I should have put in the word pragmatic. That really is the right word. That, if you want something that just encapsulates the overall framework and mentality that's driving these students and their families, it's a sort of a pragmatism. And so you notice, like, I don't mention law, and even though law is pragmatic, but it's not considered that. It's the families. So just to backtrack 1 second. So for me personally, I'm a writer myself. I'm trained as a philosopher, as a cultural critic. So these are intrinsically interesting things. Every day is interesting to me. Because I just, I grew up in New York, and, just a very, very different mindset.
Yeah.
I find myself, by the way, too, especially in essay writing, to be a cultural ambassador for a sort of a certain thinking about oneself as a person as opposed to a worker. And so that translation is really, really interesting for me. Oh, wait, can you go back to the other slide?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Don't mind. I wouldn't mind just saying a few things here that and one thing I missed here in this that I should say that for every student, okay, and it's cut a different way, but every student is looking for the American dream, like that. And I sort of feel like, now that I'm looking at these slides, that's missing a little bit. There is something about this sense of freedom and openness that is very exciting to every single student for the most part. Maybe with the Saudi Arabian students, it's different. I would say I'd put them in a different class perhaps. But what is their version of the American dream? What would that mean for that person coming from these cultures, right? And so, one, it's that upward mobility. It's moving up a couple of notches, right? So that's why they're so motivated by professional ambitions, and for whatever reasons they feel hampered in their home countries. And so that's why the social life is not as important. They tend to be they will do a lot of research about schools. That data is very important to them. It's a stabilizing force for them. It helps them orient themselves. So if there's data about career placement, internship placement, that sort of thing, that's and they will compare medical school placement and things like that. They really want that sort of information. And whether the roommate is going to be nice or naughty or whatever, it's not as much of a concern. So again, very STEM focused. But if not STEM focused, then they still want to know how their career in writing or film or whatever will lead them to a job. That's really important. Or the postgraduate work. That's also extremely important, the placement in postgraduate situations. They're socially concerned. No, they don't care about LGBTQ communities. Like that is not going to be of interest to them,
Yeah.
But so they really want to know that they're going to feel safe, right? So USC can be an issue for a lot of these families because of the murders that happened about 4 years ago, even though it was off campus. But it still plays in the imagination.
Yeah.
So safety, community, ways to volunteer. It's a very volunteeristic sort of mentality from all of these. My Saudi girls, avid volunteers. The Chinese students, it's very important for their identity to volunteer.
Very interesting.
And yet then they're looking for that rigorous, nonetheless, that the rigorous. They want to be pushed. They want to be challenged. They want to soar. That's where they're coming from.
That's so interesting. Thank you. I think that firsthand perspective is something that is missing when we just start looking at numbers and data. So I think we can build off a lot of the things Amy just said from her firsthand perspective in this next section. So this is where we're really just going to jump right into our survey. Alex is going to go through most of the data here, but just to introduce the details, one of the things that we think is really interesting about the perspective of working with the students that we worked with in this survey is that they're actually newly enrolled. Some of them actually did not enroll, but the point is that they've all completed the admissions process. And so as opposed to asking them questions in the future tense, what would you want? How do you think you're going to feel? These are questions about how did the experience work for you? What do you need? And how, has it met your expectations? And then certainly along those lines, we'll dig into the technology use and the importance of different communication channels. Take it away, Alex.
Thanks. So as Kendall mentioned, we are uncovering their actual attitudes and experiences during the admissions process. So we had about 800 respondents, and quite surprisingly, we had a near 50-50 split, male to female. Usually when we do surveys, you see a 70-30 or 60-40 favoring female. So this is good. We have a equal sampling. And most of our respondents are coming from exactly what the IIE said. They're coming from China, India, other parts of Asia, and the Middle East. And finally, we had, again, overwhelmingly 70% were undergrads, just mirroring the trends of how undergrad enrollment is outpacing graduate numbers right now. So let's get down into it. The strongest reason that students want to study abroad is simply because they're interested in a particular institution. Now, this really speaks to the importance of brand awareness in the geographic areas from where you're recruiting from. And looking at interesting breakdowns from different countries and regions, students from China and the rest of Asia decide to study abroad because they've previously attended an international high school either in their home country or in another country. So looking at this, it may be beneficial for these students to establish relationships with international high schools within your own area, and therefore you can set up a feeder system. Students from India, on the other hand, decide to study abroad because they have no career or higher ed opportunities in their home country. And now for these students, what you can do is showcase programs and majors that lead to stable, lucrative, secure careers. That's what they are seeking in their education. And finally, we saw, interestingly, that students from the Middle East decide to study abroad because they receive funding from their home government. As Kendall had mentioned before, countries are now subsidizing tuition. So countries like Saudi Arabia are having government sponsorship programs. Now, you may have noticed that the top choice or top reason that students study abroad was this other category. The responses that we saw were that the students just wanted to experience other cultures, and there was this general belief that the United States has a higher quality education system compared to their home country. Again, this is just speaking to the fact of why are students studying abroad? They want to get that quality education that's going to lead to stable, secure careers.
Amy, do you feel like this is reflective of your experience?
I want to add something here, particularly with the Chinese and the South Korean population, is that a lot of the students the international students that I work with, they also choose to come here for high school, and they will do crazy things to get over here.
Wow.
Why will they do crazy things to get over here and go to some of the most remote high schools just to get into the American college system? Is, it's the Chinese system being so competitive, so quantitative, so test driven, is for some students is just absolutely maddening.
Wow.
And I'm still working with a student. I'm her college mentor now. I worked with a student who, here's one of my favorite anecdotes, who wound up in East Texas in a very, very conservative high school, very, very remote, south of Tyler and near Louisiana. And she's from Beijing. And she didn't appreciate the culture there, but she did it anyway. And she said that she still felt freer there. She's not Christian. She didn't want to be Christian, but she still felt freer because she felt so oppressed by this memorization and this competition just based on test taking. But at the school, she could join the drum line, she could initiate an international chapel, she could initiate debates about evolution and creationism and things like that. And so there is some sense of like, when they're looking for a college, they are looking for that stable career, but then, they, in the back of their minds, they're also hoping for their own personal development that they don't feel like they have access to in their home country.
That's such great insight. Thank you.
Yeah.
So looking at their concern study abroad, not surprising here, the biggest concern is funding. Now, this coincides with the fact that 35% of international students fund their education through scholarships and government assistance. So if they don't have those personal or family funds to rely on, then international students are definitely dependent on receiving assistance from the university or from either their home government or from the United States. Now, looking at challenges specifically during the admissions process, international students had difficulty, again, securing funding, echoing their main concern for wanting to study abroad in the first place. And interestingly, in our sample, the biggest challenge was taking standardized tests, which may just be a reflection of the respondents who took our survey. And Amy, I think that you said one of the biggest challenges you see during the process for your students is actually writing the application essay. Is that right?
It's both, and I don't know if what I'm going to say is helpful about the standardized test situation. But first of all, they always have to travel somewhere.
Right.
So, and plus, this year now, the scores are delayed. I have a student in Shanghai who took the October test. He's applied early to WashU, and that new score is being held up because of, this sort of cheating, whatever went on there. There's a lot of inconveniences, like literally inconveniences.
Right.
Then, I think it'll be very interesting to see how things change when the SAT changes. They just can't score as well. The critical reading section in the SAT is always the hardest part anyway, because that kind of critical reading is not as much of a practice in people's everyday lives anymore. But it's even more so in all of the countries we're talking about. Maybe I would say on some level, with the exception of India, there isn't a critical reading practice culturally instituted into these students' lives. They don't know how to read critically. They don't think that critically. It's just not a part of their intellectual tradition. So it is the essay, the SAT essay, which is now really not going to be as much of an issue, and the critical reading sections they can't get to 700.
Interesting.
So that's a real hurdle in the critical thinking, critical reading, that component missing from what I would call almost a cultural consciousness. And so that's one of the issues. Then writing the application essay, as I was saying before, I sort of see myself sometimes as a cultural ambassador toward their ushering them into their own exploration of the self. In these cultures, who they are as a person is not a sort of prominent sort of preoccupation for them. What role they're going to play in life, how they're going to be useful, that's how they're thinking, Then you get the common application essay that asks you to talk about failure. That's the last thing they want.
Right.
They don't really off the bat, they do once you explain it to them, they don't off the bat understand, like, no, it's the overcoming of the failure that the question is asking you about, and that's sort of allows you to reveal your character. But issues about character, integrity, maybe things like big emotional upheaval in their lives, that those are the last things they want to talk about. Those are the last things they actually think are valid to talk about. They're afraid to take risks. They're afraid to reveal vulnerabilities, where the American tradition is very much still like a romanticist tradition, the depths of the soul. We're interested in the depths of your soul, sort of thing. That's what those common application questions on some level are getting at. And so there's issues of depth that we have to tackle with these students, and we have to get them to start to feel comfortable with an exploration of the self and to reveal that exploration through their essays. So there's a real cultural divide.
I think it's really interesting too, though, because I would assume, obviously, I'm not knowledgeable in the admissions process the way our guests are, but thinking too about these students in college preparedness and also expectation setting. Maybe the purging of the depths of their soul isn't what we should be expecting out of an essay that comes from a student who doesn't have that same kind of awareness that's been taught in the American system. So I think that's really interesting feedback, and something maybe our guests could comment on, or something we can think about going forward.
Right. And just as Amy was mentioning, there are multiple hurdles throughout the admissions process. Of note, the other kind of category, what people said is basically just time management. There's a lot of things that
oh my God.
Yeah, there's so many, check marks they have to tick off for both domestic and international students, but time management seems to be even more exaggerated for international.
And they're traveling. They're traveling for the SATs and the SAT 1 and the SAT 2s, I mean, it's a very, very difficult sort of thing to juggle for them.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of college preparedness, we know that this is huge for international students. And at first glance, it may seem that our respondents felt prepared to study abroad, but looking more closely, you can see that 50% felt moderately to underprepared. Now, this is a concern for institutions because students who don't feel prepared, it often correlates to retention issues.
Yeah, and I mean, I know everyone's focused on outcomes. There's so much pressure on institutions, both from a competitive enrollment perspective as well as from a federal funding perspective. And so we wanted to dig a little bit into reasons for this attrition with international students. The NAFSA reports that the sort of top few reasons why these students aren't making it through the full degree program: transfer to a better fit institution. So going straight to the heart of a lot of this conversation, making sure that students really understand what they're getting themselves into, that some of these surprises that Amy mentioned about the freedom, the liberties you can take with your personhood and your lifestyle, understanding that those need to match up for the student. Additional reasons: financial difficulties, academic difficulties, and then inadequate language skills. So again, college preparedness definitely should be top of mind. I'm sure it already is for all of you.
Now, we were really interested in comparing how many institutions our international students apply to in the U.S. versus in other countries. And right off the bat, you can see that international students are applying to multiple schools in the United States. In fact, almost 2/3 are applying to 5 or more schools. Now, compare this to the only 1 or 2 schools that they're applying to in other countries. Now, this again speaks to the fact that international students value the quality of education in the United States. They're fighting to get in here, and it mirrors the trend of domestic students who are applying to institutions in the double digits just to hedge their bets. Now, because in our other survey, the 2014 Social Admissions Report, which is one of our collaborations with CHEG, we found that most domestic students, again, are applying to 5 or 6 schools on average. So yeah,
very competitive. It doesn't seem to change. It's competitive for institutions both on the domestic and the international side.
Right. So we do know that visiting campus is a strong, if not one of the strongest indicators of enrollment. Now, you may not get this signal with international students. Again, as Amy mentioned, they simply don't have the funds to travel over here to see their top institutions. From our respondents, we see that over 50% were not able to visit campus. So how do you showcase your institution since they can't get experience firsthand? Kendall's actually going to speak to this in the next section where we talk about communication and preferred mobile preferences of our international students.
Great. And Amy, really briefly, I know that the students you work with, they're clearly, extraordinarily high achieving. It sounds like many of them have the means to travel. Do you feel like most of the students you work with make it over to a campus to visit, or is it really just dependent on the student situation?
Yeah, they don't make it over.
Really?
They don't make it over. Not the international students. They're and so really the virtual types of tours are very, very important, and they're totally plugged in.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Awesome. That's a great segue. Thank you for that. So in looking at communication preferences as well as, technological usage patterns, things like that. The interesting thing about who do you want to communicate with, this is a question we're asking in all of our surveys at Uversity, and the response never seems to change. It's really very straightforward. It's the admissions department, and it's currently enrolled students or fellow admitted students. So in the case of the international pool we looked at, clearly it's extremely important for them, given the intricacies of the admissions process, to have a direct line to the counselor. But again, when you're thinking about fit and how do you go from overcoming this distance barrier and understanding the campus you're going to be on, understanding from a student who's like you what the perspective looks like and how they've adapted and how they've transitioned is clearly really important. But again, as Alex said, with the difficulties of access, knowing that very few of these students make it to your campus, how do we make it more convenient? How do we make it more accessible? How do we make the whole system more personalized for these students? So obviously, how do you make it more personalized? This is part of communication. There are multiple channels at our institutions we can be using, and email never seems to fade. We do a lot of presentations on trends with millennials and trends with plurals, and everyone says that students don't respond to email, but there is still very much a trend. If distance is something that's not working in your favor, and there are time zone issues, and there are, different work schedules and school study schedules, email is a really convenient tool. And we're clearly seeing that response here. I don't think it's particularly surprising. And I think for most of the institutions, at least the institutions we work with, email is still one of their preferred channels. So again, pretty straightforward data. But what's interesting is when you break this data down. So when we looked at students from China, the preferred communication channel completely changes. So the students from China, the number one channel they prefer to use during the admission process is live chat. The second most preferred is in person, no surprise there. And the third are messaging apps. So a lot of the conversations we hear about WhatsApp, Fire Chat, Line, all these different tools, they're clearly of significance to specific student populations. And we're going to dig a little bit more into that. One caveat with that data that I would share is that I think one of the things we never want to do is say, institutions, there's a new technology, go do it now. That is not necessarily the strategy that we're advocating here, but what we are trying to explain is simply what you already know, that these different areas require different means of communication. And it's just, I think, particularly interesting that the Chinese are so farther ahead in the sort of real-time, very, very interactive, very mobily dependent communication channels. So on that note,
that is very much a part of their culture, is the mobile app. Huge. I mean, for the trains, for everything, that's what they're oriented toward.
And clearly, again, if we're looking at our student sample, 95% own a smartphone, iPhone, Android, the most common platforms. no surprise, but this is higher. When we survey domestic students, we get somewhere between 85 and 92. So still obviously more than the majority, I mean, almost the entire population, but particularly interesting here.
And they will also, all of my students right now, they all have access to a VPN and have figured out how to work with Google Docs as well.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It's really important for them to be able to communicate. They want to, and they will figure it out.
I mean, I had no idea. That's really, really interesting. So mobile activity, again, I think looking at this, maybe not really, really surprising data, visited a university website on their phones. Of course they did. They're all on mobile all day long, just like our domestic students. But what is interesting here is the numbers for taken a virtual campus tour, as well as submitted a college application. This is definitely something we're really interested over here in looking at. That's astonishing to me. An application, as we've just discussed, is extremely complicated, and the fact that they're relying on their phones to do it is really interesting. But then again, I think when we look at this by breakdown, there are some significant changes in how this data looks. So students from India prefer texting with college admission. So the most common thing they're doing on their phone during the admissions process is actually texting. We hear a lot about texting. A lot of schools are implementing different strategies here. Clearly, that's very relevant to that audience. But interestingly, students from China reflect similar patterns to what we saw in the previous slide. They're using the live chat with college admissions. They're using video chat, and they're scheduling campus visits and virtual campus tours. So again, a more sort of, I think, advanced adoption in that culture, and it's clearly very much reflected in their activity during the admissions process.
I have Skyped with an Indian student, I forget what city, while he was on a bus.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just they want to connect, and they will find, these are just for them really handy ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, I mean, again, that speaks directly to this slide. So one of the things we wanted to look at that really hasn't been in many other surveys is this opening up of the messaging application usage. So, earlier this year, there were big conversations around WhatsApp. Many of you may have heard of Fire Chat because of recent protests in Hong Kong, and the students there were using it. So again, looking at this breakdown, WhatsApp is clearly the densest in terms of the penetration of this population, but as is our style, we broke this down. So we wanted to look at students from China and India, as well as sort of the rest of the Asian population surveyed. So for the Chinese students, WeChat. Amy, I know you use WeChat.
I'm checking. I have a flag thing right now.
Yeah, there you go. For the Indian students, it is WhatsApp. And then for students from other parts of Asia, Line was one of their things. So, again, this just speaks to tailoring these types of tools to the areas that are really relevant to your student population. And then one additional piece here that we wanted to talk about, I mentioned at the beginning that Uversity is creating mobile tools to connect students with other admitted students, as well as to connect them to the institutions they want to enroll in. And we wanted to look at those students' activities. So, regardless of whether it's our product or our tool or some other type of community that you've created for your students, what are the things they're really looking for help doing, and where do they want connections, receiving admissions information, connecting with students like them, and making new friends. And then, to be honest, you see that also academic piece does definitely play a role here. So I think just an interesting tie-in to what do these students really need during the process, and who do they want this sort of back and forth, organic, authentic conversation to be held with.
Yeah, so as we mentioned before, this is a unique sample. We've actually surveyed international students who have gone through the admissions process. And actually, over 4/5 of our sample have enrolled at an institution in the United States. Majority of those felt as though their first few months on campus have lived up to their college expectations. But more intriguing to us is what happens to those other students who didn't enroll. What are their reasons? Number one, really not a surprise here. Number one, number three were actually funding. So they didn't have enough personal funding, or they didn't receive enough financial assistance from the US government. So again, just echoing the trend that funding is a huge concern for these students, especially given that they have to verify their financial stability to pay for their education. So when they can't do this, they can't enroll. Some other reasons for non-enrolling, which we found pretty intriguing, was that some students just preferred to defer their enrollment to either the next semester or the next year. Some other unfortunate inconvenience as well is that they just had visa issues. So again, just something that needs to be reminded about international students, that they may need more help in other areas that admissions counselors aren't yet used to.
Well, and that's what happened with the girl from Saudi Arabia. She wanted to defer, and she sort of, in her mind, she just had all these new life questions. And I feel like, if a university in its presentation to a student through a chat, through an app, through chatting, whatever sets, sort of kinds of relationships that are set up, that they sort of present themselves as, we're going to guide you to your future. Like, that sort of thing in this way, in that way, in that way, in that way. I think there might, the other reasons could possibly start to diminish.
Mm-hmm.
So, really creating like, we're going to take you by the hand, and sort of get you to graduation sort of thing.
Right.
Show you the path.
I mean, again, Amy's just nailing it with our transitions, because it's a perfect segue into what I know you're all here for, and I know we're running up against the clock, so I apologize. Of course, we'll be sending this out if any of you have to drop off. We're going to try to go through the recommendations pretty quickly and get to questions. We broke this out into a couple of sections. So institutional attractiveness, these are sort of these big bucket strategic areas that many of you are probably already heavily focused on. Since we have heard so much about funding and the limitations there, in spite of the conversation happening that these students always pay full sticker, that that higher education in the U.S. is the new wedding, we're still seeing funding issues. So offering scholarships that are specific to students in specific areas, very empowering for them, and honestly, one of the largest hurdles. And then as Amy had spoken to, these are ambitious and high achieving and selective individuals for the most part, and internship opportunities highlighting ways that the learning resources at your institutions are different and advanced. Very, very important. And then, of course, it can't be said enough, the focus on career placement. And I think Amy had a great anecdote when we talked last week about, there is a propensity for a lot of the students, particularly the ones she works with in China, to lean towards these urban, research-oriented institutions so that students can go into one of these sort of top-line pre-med, business, or engineering backgrounds. But not every school is going to be a STEM, research powerhouse. And that's fine, because not every student is actually going to want that or really fit that mold. And so I think looking at alumni in your network from your strongest degree programs and identifying how these students can make their way and sort of live up that sort of American dream, for sort of a lack of a better term, is really influential and something that could have a positive impact for institutions. And again, something we can't say enough, making information easy to find. Have a dedicated landing page for international students, have a dedicated counselor, have somebody who's really focused on the needs of these students, because they're clearly quite different. And Amy, of course, hop in anytime. So for mobile preparedness, this is sort of the area that Uversity always likes to dig into. I think the most important takeaway that we've heard, and again, Amy shared some awesome anecdotal evidence of this, these students aren't traveling to their institution of choice more or less before they come here. And even the ones that do have the fortunate situation of getting to come and visit a campus often are only doing it once. So it's really unrealistic to assume that these students are going to get the impression and understanding of your school from a website or from a view book. And so the idea of creating and leveraging social media and all of these different mobile tools, virtual chats, virtual campus tours, live chat on your admissions website so that students can ask back and forth, anything that corresponds to creating a relationship as opposed to just answering a one-off email is really going to benefit you and the student during this process.
They're looking for relationships.
Right.
They really are. And well, two things I want to say. One is that on the campus tours, if they do come to look at schools, they're looking at the Ivy Leagues and Stanford, whether the student is eligible for that school or not. Like these are, it's like going to Disneyland. And that's the way it plays in the imagination. So it seems to me, and I don't know who's in the audience, so but if we're dealing with our non top 10, top 20 schools in again in the sort of popular imagination, there have to be other ways to lure student interest, and maybe just to think about, well, what is that, what do people want in Stanford other than the brand name? I mean, besides that, but what is Stanford offering? Is it entrepreneurial, a very entrepreneurial, dynamic sort of environment? So thinking through the university, thinking about one's own university culture in relation, would be, I think, a really interesting way to sort of capture the attention of these students. And I doubt it's going to be through a campus visit. I really do think the mobile, the mobile and digital, as well as Skype as well, and that personal connection is really is what is going to do that. Then there was something else I wanted to say, and now I can't. Go on, Kendall, because
we have one more slide to jog your memory.
Okay.
This is the sort of last section of the recommendations, and I think in some ways these are the ones that we're really all here to talk about. They're the intangibles. They're the things that relate to a really deep understanding of one's culture and a respect for what a big decision this is for students. These are kids who are coming for various reasons, including the career options, the pressure from family, and looking at ways that we can really stress support, nurturing environments. It may sound counterintuitive given what we know about how competitive the atmosphere is, but in reality, these are still adolescents. They're kids and they're being asked to travel a very long way from their culture and their home. So I think promoting areas of your institution that are organized, campus clubs, volunteerism, as Amy had mentioned, religious organizations, whatever it is, areas that feel structured and familiar and meaningful to these students.
And if there was a space in an app or on the website geared toward international students, what do Chinese students really do from an extracurricular perspective? What do Indian students do? What sports do they play? What clubs? And highlight those very specific clubs.
Yes.
I think that would be extremely helpful. Two more things that I do want to say. One is that students tend to view admissions officers and directors as authority figures, and so they're afraid to contact them. They're afraid, they don't realize that it's become more of a dialogic relationship. So, and that, would be very, very pleasing, I think, for a student to, and I've had the student Shanghai, work with, sort of the admissions from a school in the States, and it's been just a really nice sort of conversation that they've been having. So that's, that I think is very important for them to realize that you're not just gatekeepers. You're there to sort of get to know them, start relationships, see if it might work out, that sort of thing. The other thing too is, working with students and trying to attract students to schools that are not Stanford, which is perfectly legitimate, fine thing to be. It's just it plays such a role in the imagination, is to, again, stress to students that really it's the graduate degree that matters most in terms of the job, and that it's really the excellent foundational undergraduate degree leading to med school, B school, grad school, again, stressing the placement in graduate school.
Right. Those are, I mean, that's, I think, the kind of sort of under the hood less intuitive type of recommendation that's so helpful from the student perspective. So I apologize. I know we're slightly over time. I know people are starting to have to run off to other meetings. There are multiple options, as you can see here, to follow up with us with specific questions. I don't know if there are any questions at the moment. I know one came in earlier that we can answer really quickly, and then we'll be happy to follow up with you if there's anything else you want to know. So someone had written in, if email is so popular, you know, and we're seeing, I think the number was 84% of students using it, what's the reason? You know, there are all these other things. Why do I need to tell my team to work on so many different channels? Which is a great question. I think our point with that data is really just to say it's know your student population. Email is clearly a significant tool for students who are, you know, out of different time zones and far away from your campus. So there's no reason not to continue leveraging email. It's a really powerful tool. But these other areas, you know, Skype, as she mentioned, WeChat, if your students are coming from China, tools that function as a day-to-day utility for these students are going to be a better, more personal way to reach them. Okay, well, as always, I feel like we've covered a lot and not a whole lot of time. So as I said, we'll be sending out the presentation as well as the recording, and we'll also be following up with some, you know, other data points and other breakdowns as we create the addendums. So don't forget to tweet at us if you have any additional questions. The hashtag is INTLSP, so International Student Perspectives. And thank you again. We really appreciate your time and your interest. Thank you so much, Amy, for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.